Lord, who for our sake did fast 40 days and 40 nights, give us self-discipline to pursue godliness, righteous thoughts. In Jesus' name, amen. We are in Charles Beard's Martin Luther and the Reformation in German until the close of the Diet of Worms. Chapter 3, the Renaissance in Germany. We're not in this place concerned with the inquiry into the obscure and slow-working causes which produced the movement of the human mind, known as the Renaissance. One period imperceptibly grows into another. Each age necessarily holds in itself the germ of its successor. The facts as to the Renaissance which we have chiefly to bear in mind are that the movement, beginning in Italy, spread thence to other countries of Europe, and it was largely influenced by the revived study of Latin, still more of Greek literature. In the 14th century, Latin was, side by side with Italian, a living language in Italy. It was the dialect of religion, diplomacy, and to a large extent literature. Petrarch relied on immortality more on his Africa than on his Canzoni. Dante wrote indifferently in either tongue. In the molding hands of the church, it had assumed a new form without ceasing to be itself. The Latin of the Vulgate, if not Ciceronian, is a flexible, majestic, expressive tongue. And though the cadences of medieval hymns are widely different from those of Virgil, they hardly yield to them in sonorous sweetness. When therefore it began to be thought once more that there was nothing inconsistent with the profession of a Christian faith in reading Latin orators and poets, as well as Latin fathers, Italy seemed only to be reclaiming a neglected heritage. It is true that her scholars had much to learn and unlearn before they could even approach the standard of Ciceronian purity of speech. Not till successive generations had applied themselves to the task did they realize how much the ages of faith had forgotten. But as they slowly toiled, they awoke to the fact that men had left behind them a very different world from that which the church had formed and inspired. The old classical spirit began to glow within them once more. Latin literature, however, is largely imitative. One of its chief functions has been to transmit and diffuse the spirit of Greece. The Italian Renaissance, therefore, did not assume its proper character until the fall of Constantinople drove Greek teachers westward, and the charm of the Hellas again began to work. Plato and still more Aristotle had dominated those philosophic studies in which the Middle Ages took so much delight. But men now went back from imperfect translations and jejune commentaries to the originals, finding the masters of Greek thought were fit for better things than the mere provision of an intellectual framework for scholastic Christianity. Philosophical speculation again took an independent flight, and the idea of science slowly possessed itself of men's minds. These, to me, are a little bit of overstatements. We'll listen in as manuscripts of epic and drama and history were imported and transcribed. As the initial difficulties of a copious and flexible language were slowly mastered, a new world seemed open, full of attraction and delight, maybe exhaustion with the past and the corruptions of the past, yet utterly unlike anything that was realized in Christian Europe, a world in which men stood in happy communion with nature, whose enjoyments they freely tasted, whose successes they fearlessly explored, and where existence was always free, various, poignant, and full. Oh boy. It was as if there were a possibility of going back to the fresh youth of humanity, in which strength and beauty were the natural expressions of life, when renunciation was not yet a virtue, nor self-maceration the secret of peace. Above all, the intellectual contagion which the Greek spirit always carries with it began to operate, and without quite knowing whither they tended, men went out in a quest of a new goal of thought and life. Nevertheless, the Italian Renaissance cannot be called productive. It sped itself in acquiring a mastery of the new instruments of thought, and having acquired it, did very little with them. Tell that to the Florentines there, Charles. The process was longer, more difficult one than we, with all the materials of classical erudition amassed and arranged, now find it easy to conceive. Grammars had to be constructed, dictionaries to be compiled, texts to be settled, commentaries to be made, the life of the ancients to be studied as well as their languages, a knowledge of their history to be added to the knowledge of their thought. The labors of many generations were needed to complete the task, nor, if we include in it the functions of criticism, is it yet completed. The work of the Renaissance may perhaps be defined to be the reconciliation of the ancient with the medieval spirit and their fusion into modern thought and life. And the great Italian scholars of the 14th and 15th centuries were concerned with this only in its earliest stages. It is no disparagement of their labors to admit that they did not fully understand either their scope or their worth, while they were writing prose which should contain no phrase unused by Cicero, while they were polishing verses to imitate the cadences of Ovid. They were not so much accomplishing any immediate result of importance as paving the way for better work by a succeeding generation. These school exercises are hopelessly forgotten. If the scholars of the Renaissance have left behind them anything with life in it, it is the vernacular prose and verse of which they thought little. The century which is peculiarly their own is almost a blank in the history of Italian literature. We pass at a bound from Petrarch, Dante, Boccaccio to Pulci, Boiardo, Ariosto. If they were not great scholars, it was because they could not be. The idea and possibility of great scholarship have been slowly evolved since they became silent. Tell that to Thomas Aquinas in Naples. They laid the foundations of modern erudition. And strong foundations are always buried out of sight. This is just romanticization in some ways. The revival of letters in Italy neither led to any activity of theological thought nor produced any religious reformation. They're all serving their bellies. Lorenzo and Valla is the only humanist whose name can be mentioned in this connection. He exposed the fiction of the donation of Constantine. He criticized the Latin of the Vulgate. He expressed doubts as to the authenticity of the Apostles' Creed. His notes on the New Testament are the beginning of modern biblical criticism. Give me a break. This guy be making such a Charlie. But it is characteristic of the class and the time to which he belonged that he should escape from the clutches of the Inquisition only by a cynical profession of conformity with the Church, and owe to the purity of his Latinity the lucrative office of secretary to Pope Niccolo V. Open rebellion against the Church was a thing of much later date. It belongs to the time when the reverberation of the German Reformation it made itself heard in Italy. The earlier humanists conformed and disbelieved. The idea that the new learning could be used to clear the foundations of Christian theory or to reform the abuses of the church never seemed to have occurred to them. Nor can I find that in Italy the Renaissance retarded for a moment the swift progress of ecclesiastical corruption. In one way, indeed, it accelerated it. The frank naturalness of the classic life with which the humanists were making themselves acquainted was infinitely attractive to men already prone to dislike and disbelieve in ascetic virtue. Nor when Zion ran riot was stern and self-resistant to be expected of Olympus. It would not be too much to say that many of the humanists were not only pagan in practice, but veiled a pagan creed by a very transparent pretense to orthodox belief. Such men as Gemistus, Plato, and Marsilio Ficino were avowed Platonists. Others did not take life seriously enough to care even to varnish their self-indulgence with a philosophic theory. The fact is that in Italy, the church broke down more conspicuously than in any other country. Like the acolyte, she was too near the altar to have any reverence for it left. In Rome, all ecclesiastical traffic centered. Thither men came to weave their intrigues and to compass their purposes of greed. There the wealth of every national church was spent in luxury and vice. For the time, the fire of monastic piety had ceased to burn, except in a few hearts here and there, and there was no other to take its place. The impulse given by the Renaissance to art and archaeology determined the direction of educated taste. What humanists and their patrons cared for was a new manuscript of a classic poet, a freshly disinterred piece of ancient sculpture, a medal with an apt legend, a porcelain dish glowing with a novel adaptation of an old myth. But Christian antiquity lay in the dust of neglect. It was left to Basel and to Alcala to print the New Testament Greek. Only when the treasures of classical literature seemed to be exhausted did editions of the Fathers sparingly issue from the presses of Italy. And this incapacity for religious thought, almost for serious thought of any kind, continued to be the bane of Italian humanism. It went on polishing Ciceronian phrases, weaving imitative verses, long after the learning which it taught the graver northern nations had been applied by them to shake the foundations of medieval Christianity, till at last it failed to perform even its own limited function with success, and leadership in erudition passed to France and to Holland. Germany in the 14th century had already 5 universities: Prague, 1348, Vienna, 1365, Heidelberg, 1385, Cologne, 1388, Erfurt, 1392, Leipzig, 1409, Rostock, 1419. All belonged to the strictly medieval order of things and were dedicated to the old learning. Theology and its combination with scholastic philosophy, medicine, the civil and canon law were the subjects of study. The method was as dry as the matter of teaching was limited and jejune. The creative period of medieval philosophy was past, and no great teacher like Reuchlin or Abelard attracted round his desk crowds of disciples to listen to the exposition of living speculation. The student plodded his way through a rigidly prescribed course of lectures and disputations, which gave him a degree and qualified him for the exercise of a profession. At independent research studies that did not pay, men laughed. Between 1440 and 1450, Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, afterwards Pope Pius II, was at Vienna, where he filled the office of imperial secretary. Himself a child of the Italian Renaissance, at once polished by intellectual culture and tainted by its moral laxity, he found himself at the court of Frederick III, among a half-barbarous generation who looked down with scorn on his unpractical zeal for literature. Though not what we should now call a poet, he had received his laurel crown at Frankfurt from the emperor. Until he entered the sacred college, was wont to sign his letters, Aeneas Silvius Poeta. But the men who taught and studied at Vienna would have nothing to do with polite literature. Poetry, they said, neither clothed nor fed them. Only Justinian and Hippocrates filled the purse. At Koln, which was throughout its history a conservative university, the same state of things existed half a century later, when in other parts of learning the new light had long been shining. The letter of Conrad Keltis, a well-known humanist, gives a dreary account both of what was studied and what was neglected. Formal dialectics were alone valued. No one teaches the Latin grammar. No one studies the orators. Mathematics, astronomy, natural history are unknown. Poetry is ridiculed. Men draw back in horror from the books of Ovid and Cicero, as Jews from swine flesh. What was true of Vienna and Koln could hardly be conspicuously true of the older German universities in the first half of the 15th century. It may be worthwhile to describe somewhat more minutely this course of study at one of these universities. Knowledge was originally regarded as comprised in the three sciences of theology, medicine, and law, and in the seven liberal arts, proficiency in which was necessary preliminary to graduation in any science. Each of the sciences was itself a faculty. The arts, taken collectively, made a fourth. The seven were, however, again divided into two parts: the lesser or trivium, grammar, rhetoric, music; quadrivium, dialectics, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy. At a somewhat later period, when the works of Aristotle began to exercise an influence upon education, Aquinas, a different arrangement prevailed. The University of Erfurt, for instance, in the 15th century, the seven liberal arts were taken to be grammar, rhetoric, dialectics, mathematics, physics, metaphysics, and morals. Take these words in a large sense, which modern thought puts on them, and you have the materials of an almost complete education. But in reality, they each stood for a dull and monotonous study of wretched textbooks, and generally for the cultivation of a power of disputation conducted under the limitations of the most formal logic, as remote as well could be from sound knowledge or original thought. Greek was an unknown tongue. Only a very few of the Latin classics received a perfunctory attention. Boethius was preferred to Cicero, and the moral sentences ascribed to Cato to either. Rules couched in barbarous Latin verse were committed to memory. Aristotle was known only in incorrect Latin translations, which many of the taught, and some of the teachers probably supposed to be the originals. Matters were not mended when the student, having passed through the preliminary course of arts, advanced to the study of sciences. Theology meant an acquaintance with the sentences of Peter Lombard, or in other cases with the Summa of Thomas Aquinas. In medicine, Galen was the authority from which there was no appeal. On every side, the student was fenced round by traditions and prejudices through which it is impossible to break. In truth, he had no means of knowing that there was a wider and fairer world beyond. Till the classical revival came, every decade made the yoke of prescription heavier and heavier, and each generation of students, therefore, a feebler copy of the last. Intercourse, political and religious, between Germany and Italy was always more or less active, and whatever intellectual forces powerfully moved the latter were sure or sooner or later to influence the former. At the beginning of the 15th century, the great councils of Constance and Basel brought the two nations together on German ground, not, we may be certain, without some effectual contact of the intellectual kind. Poggio Bracciolini, the Florentine humanist, attended the first, making it the opportunity of a search through the convent libraries of Germany and Switzerland for manuscripts of the classics. One result of the second was to bring Aeneas Sylvius to Vienna, where he naturally gathered around him a body of friends like-minded with himself in devotion to literary culture. But it was in the latter half of this century that new learning touched and awoke Germany. The transition was sudden from the state of things which I have indicated to one of an eager pursuit of classical learning, joyful and sustained intellectual activity, of ardent desire to share the erudition which Italy held out to Europe. It was about 1455 that Gutenberg issued from his press at Mainz the first book printed from movable types, since known as the Mazarin Bible. This date marks the turning point. The invention of printing urged on the new day with startling rapidity. Reuchlin was born in the same year. Erasmus, the flower of German humanism, only 12 years later. Nor can there be more striking evidence of the awakening of the national mind than the fact that in the half century between 1456 and 1506, 9 new universities were founded. Greifswald, 1456. A little later, Freiburg, Basel, 1460. Ingolstadt and Trier, 1472. Tubingen and Mainz, 1477. Wittenberg, 1502. Frankfurt on the Oder, 1506. I do not mean that all or any of these were established in the express interest of new learning. Some of them were strongholds of reaction, while older bodies like Erfurt and Heidelberg welcomed fresh light. They could not help but becoming centers of intellectual activity in which the fresh light found its way, from which it radiated. The new period is often reckoned from the date of Rudolf Agricola's visit to Italy, which was about 1476. A story which has been handed down from one author to another without sufficient critical examination tells how Thomas à Kempis, who with the Brethren of the Common Life was engaged in teaching, advised 6 of his best pupils to repair to Italy to embrace their opportunities of instruction which Germany could not have. These were Rudolf Lange, Count Moritz von Spiegelberg, Rudolf Agricola, Alexander Hagius, Antonius Liber, and Ludwig Dringenberg. But the newest research not only seems to show by comparison of dates that the basis on which this story rests is uncertain, but casts doubts on the supposed obligations of German schools at this period to the brotherhood founded by Gerhard Group. That there were good schools at Deventer and Munster, and at other places in Westphalia and on the Lower Rhine, which played an important part in the development of education is certain, as well that in some of them were the brethren taught, while others took a lively and practical interest. What now seems to be at least doubtful is that these can rightly be called the brethren's schools, and that certain improvements in the art of education which were then introduced can be directly traced to their influence. Perhaps it was easier for the new learning to make its way into schools which were under the direction of a single teacher than into universities necessarily more influenced by tradition, where the old teaching resisted innovation with the tenacity of a vested interest. Of the 6 men just mentioned, at least 5 took an active part in such schools. Rudolf Lange, 1438 to 1519, a dignified churchman at Munster, not only established the cathedral school of that city on a fresh footing, but made himself the center of an educational propaganda in the towns round about. Count Moritz von Spiegelberg, 1420 to 1493, who became canon of Koln and provost of Emmerich, invited Antonius Liber, who at different periods of his life taught at Kempen and Alkmaar, to establish a school at Emmerich also. Alexander Hegius taught in the school of Deventer, to which belongs the honor of having trained the young Erasmus. But the most celebrated of this group of schoolmasters was Ludwig Dringenberg, who died about 1490, who was the head of a school at Schlettstadt in Alsace, which founded in 1450, soon numbered 900 pupils, and was the center from which the new learning spread itself along the upper Rhine. It was from these schools to the universities that the contagion of learning spread. The more dignified bodies standing in closer relations with the church and full of medieval traditions were slow to move. Lange and Spiegelberg, whether advised by Thomas à Kempis or not, resolved to come across the Alps. But before doing so, Lange spent some time at the University of Erfurt from the year 1460 onwards, teaching Peter Buder and Jacobus Publicus Rufus, both professors of the new learning and the last a Florentine by birth. A little later came to Erfurt a young nobleman of the Rhineland, Johannes von Dalberg, 1445 to 1503, also attracted by the new teachers who, breaking through the old prescriptions, professed poetry and oratory. Then followed the journey to Italy, where Lange, Spiegelberg, Dalberg, and Agricola all met. I've already spoken of the ecclesiastical preferment enjoyed by 2 of the first. Dalberg became Prince Bishop of Worms, and at the invitation of Philip, Elector Palatine, Chancellor of the University of Heidelberg. There he did what he could to introduce the new learning into that already famous institution, laying the foundations of its library and engaging in its services the best scholarship of the day. It was at his persuasion that Agricola, 1443 to 1485, came to the fair city on the Neckar, and not so much teaching as diffusing literary culture round about him, spent there the last years of his too brief life. These elder German humanists stand in marked contrast to the Italian scholars at whose feet they sat. They were grave men, taking life and learning in as good earnest Catholics who wished to reform the abuses of the Church without impugning her authority or touching her doctrine, and sincerely anxious to use their erudition in the service of religion. They poured new wine into the old bottles. Agricola died in 1485, when Luther was only just born. Lange, whose honorable life was prolonged till 1519, is said to have welcomed the fresh outbreak of revolt. Closely connected with Dolberg and the scholars of the Rhineland was Jacob Wimpfeling, 1450 to 1528, who with Geiler von Kaiserberg, already mentioned in another connection, and Sebastian Brandt may be taken to represent the older humanists of Alsace. Born in Schlettstadt, he naturally received his education in Dringenberg School, then in its first activity, and afterwards visited in turn the universities of Freiburg, Erfurt, and Heidelberg. He was a scholar and nothing more. No gleam of genius irradiates anything he's left behind in prose or verse. His best claims to remembrance are his genuine devotion to learning and zeal for education, which he manifested in more ways than one. And here we'll end this segment. Glory be to the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost.